Your squad is ready for you to lead them through. With Johnny 7 OMA, you charge.
Fire grenade. Bullseye for Johnny 7. Watch out, tank. Fire anti-armor shell. Fire anti-tank rocket. Johnny 7's got him on the run. Johnny 7 fires bullets like a rifle. Fires like a Tommy gun. Now it's a cap-firing pistol.
You've won with Johnny 7, the one-man army gun.
It's 7 guns in one. Let's count them. 1 is a grenade launcher. 2 anti-armor gun. 3 anti-tank gun. 4 bullet-firing rifle. 5 Tommy gun. 6 anti-bunker gun. 7 cap-firing pistol.
There's no other gun like it. To be sure, look for Johnny 7 OMA, the one-man army by Topper.
Now, NBC News correspondent Frank McGee.
A massive heaving of the earth, followed by giant waves of water and an outbreak of fires, has killed an untold number of persons and devastated sections of the Pacific coast from Alaska to California. It began at 36 minutes past 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time last night, when the earth shifted at a point near the southeast entrance to Prince William Sound, 150 miles southeast of Anchorage, Alaska. In Anchorage, it was just past 5:30, the height of the Friday afternoon rush hour. At that moment, Mrs. Jean Chance of radio station KENI was driving downtown. She felt the first wave of what would be 4 hours of strong earth tremors.
After that first little wave, there was a terrific jolt, and it continued to roll and get harder and harder. I myself was sitting in my car, stopped at a traffic light about 2 blocks from the city police station, the public safety building, where the police station and the fire station are both housed. My first thought was that as I hit my brake to stop at the red light, that I'd had a blowout. And then I realized the car was continuing to rock harder and harder, and I noticed the cars around me were rocking too. Then I saw that people walking along the side of the street grabbed hold of each other and ran out in the middle of the street to get away from the power lines. They clung to each other in order to stand up. Other people walking out of a supermarket on one corner of the intersection grabbed the brick walls and tried to keep from falling down. A service station on the other side of the corner had 5 cars parked a pretty good distance from each other, but parked side by side. As I sat there and watched, those cars were picked up and slammed into each other and separated and slammed into each other again and again, much like an accordion opening and closing. My own car, as I sat there with my foot on the brake, was bounced from one side of the street to another. In another portion of the city, in fact, just about 2 blocks away from the J.C. Penney building, as I proceeded to do my news coverage, I discovered that a whole 2-block area had collapsed and fallen into a hole that it had created itself. The earthquake had simply created a gap where buildings, parked cars, and the street, 4th Avenue, right in downtown Anchorage, had sunk to a depth of about 30 feet.
96 dead have been counted. The others cannot be counted until they are found in the rubble. As of this hour, we know this of these places. Anchorage, 3 known dead, 21 injured. 30 blocks in the heart of the city lie in ruins. The earth split into 2 great cracks as much as 12 feet deep, 50 feet wide. 3-story concrete buildings tumbled or caved in on themselves. Expensive homes on a bluff overlooking an inlet collapsed, and some appeared to simply slide down into the water below. A control tower at the airport collapsed, thousands of feet of runway buckled, 1 million gallons of jet fuel cascaded from ruptured tanks. Gas mains broke, power lines snapped, water mains ruptured. There were no major fires in Anchorage. Kodiak, 50 dead, as many missing. Tidal waves 17 feet high surged along the perimeter of the island, wiping out a number of small fishing villages. A fishing boat radioed it was picking up survivors from one, Togayak. Seward, 3 dead, 20 missing. Oil storage tanks burst, caught fire, and blazed throughout the night. Waterfront facilities of the Alaskan Railroad were destroyed. Rail and highways out of the city are impassable. An oil tanker is on the rocks. Damage in Seward has put gasoline in Anchorage in short supply. It's being rationed for emergency use only. Valdez, 28 dead, 26 missing. On the Sound, where the quake began, Valdez was hit by 2 big tidal waves after the tremor. A dock was splintered by the quake, caught fire when oil tanks burst. The tidal waves swept a number of longshoremen and others on the dock out to sea. People fled to a summit of a mountain pass to escape the water. Cordova, a tidal wave rolled into the Cape Elias flight station, washed a Coast Guardsman out to sea. He was reported drowned. He is the only reported military fatality so far. The cutter Sedge was washed ashore while trying to get out of the Cordova harbor. Other Alaskan points have reported damage, but so far, no deaths. A dock collapsed at Sitka. Residents of Ketchikan climbed to high ground following tidal wave warnings. A Coast Guard station was evacuated at Yakutat. A lighthouse at Sitkanak was damaged, and destruction was extensive in Old Harbor. From Alaska, the devastation riding on tidal waves rolled south along the Pacific coast. At Depot Bay, Oregon, the waves caught a family of 6 in sleeping bags off the shore of Beverly Beach State Park. Of the 4 children, 1 drowned, 3 are missing. The mother and father were injured. The tidal waves varied in height from only a few feet at San Francisco to 17 feet in Kodiak. They were reported in the Hawaiian Islands and Japan, and according to one clocking, traveled 100 miles in 25 minutes. Crescent City, California is 1,400 miles from Alaska on the California-Oregon border. It's built along Elm Creek. Shortly after midnight and without warning, the tidal wave sent a wall of water rushing into Elm Creek, which then splashed 5-foot waves across a 14-block area. Here is a film report from Dean Mell, NBC News, station KRON-TV in San Francisco.
Crescent City is an incredible scene of devastation caused by the repeated tidal surges from Alaska, 1,500 miles to the north. Power lines were broken, touching off a fire at a gasoline fuel storage plant. Storage tanks exploded into flames, threatening other nearby fuel storage facilities. The fires burned uncontrolled because there is no way for firemen to get to them. Other fires were burning in the downtown area. The first tidal wave rolled over the city's unprotected waterfront and slammed into the downtown section 7 hours after it was spawned by the Alaskan earthquake, among the most powerful in recorded history. A 5-foot wave of water still carried enough sledgehammer force to knock buildings from their foundations, destroy power facilities, and ruin or damage every building in the downtown section of this lumber and fishing community of 3,000 persons. The town was flooded from 2 sides. The first tidal wave rolled through an area 5 blocks deep and 14 blocks long in the downtown section. Cars were scattered like toys on top of each other, under buildings, and on top of buildings. Debris from the Pacific Ocean piled up in the streets. The same wave backed up Elk Creek along the edge of town and slopped over the banks to flood another 4 by 8 block area. However, damage in the outlying areas was nowhere near as extensive as in the downtown sections. The reported deaths vary from 7 to 10, depending upon the source. Another 24 persons are missing. Men are searching for wives, wives hunting for husbands. Searchers in some cases saw their loved ones borne away on a wave of water. Ironically, the greatest loss of life and property came after everyone thought the tidal wave danger had passed. There was one surge shortly after midnight, and although water crept 3 blocks inland, it quickly subsided, causing relatively little damage. Townspeople who had evacuated the seashore areas began returning to their homes. Ominously, there were a few more surges, each larger than its predecessor. Then, an hour and a half after the first one, the tidal wave backlashed and crashed all of its enormous recoiled fury against the town. Mason Hillsbury lives at the south end of town. He said he and his wife, 2 men, and another woman were at the side of their home when the big wave struck. Hillsbury managed to cling to the side of the building, but the others were swept away. A boat out in Crescent Bay carried 7 persons. It overturned, and later 2 bodies washed ashore. At least 70 persons were reported injured by the onrush of water. 4 vessels sank in the harbor. 6 more were thrown up onto the beach. Violent currents full of debris are still swirling at the mouth of Crescent Harbor, making entry into the harbor unsafe. The massive tidal waves sped down the Pacific coast at an estimated 500 miles an hour. Damage at Crescent City was estimated at $20 million by Del Norte County Sheriff Oswald Hofgaard. Police and sheriff's deputies are patrolling the business district to prevent looting. All along the Pacific coast, fishing boats and yachts were torn from their moorings by the surging waters. Many owners took their boats out to sea, following the advice of the Coast Guard, which ordered all of its craft out to sea. In San Francisco Bay, a 5-foot wall of water surged through the Golden Gate and refloated a beached ferry boat and a 350-ton houseboat. But nowhere along the California coast did the tidal wave cause such havoc as here at Crescent City. It was the worst disaster the community has ever suffered. Governor Brown flew to Crescent City and was awestruck by the devastation. He told Mayor William Peep, "This is unbelievable." Brown declared the city a disaster area and threw the full resources of the Civil Defense Organization into action. The governor walked through the wreckage, shaking hands and offering condolences. The governor said helplessly, "I can actually do very little in these situations." Rumors that new waves are on the way from a second earthquake in Alaska this afternoon are sending people scurrying to higher ground. Although Governor Brown had said there is little anyone can do, yet there is much that must be done. That which remains after every great catastrophe: count the dead, care for the survivors, clean up the wreckage, and start to rebuild. This is Dean Mell, NBC News, San Francisco.
In what the seismologists call an apparent coincidence, there was a slight twitching of the earth along the Texas-Louisiana coast at about the same time as the big Alaskan quake. Small as it was, it still caused tidal waves up to 6 feet. Crews on offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico said the water suddenly sagged about 6 feet and then surged back about 6 feet above normal. For miles inland, bayous sloshed over their banks, flooded highways, left debris behind. On canals and rivers, boats and barges bobbed and bounced as the waves washed beneath them. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 80 miles inland, a homeowner was admiring his new swimming pool when suddenly water sloshed over one side of it. In Golden Meadow, Louisiana, a fisherman's bar located on a bayou rapidly emptied when the bayou sent a wave of water out of its banks and through the bar door. But back nearer Alaska, the tidal waves crashed along the coast of the Washington area, knocked out bridges, and forced evacuation of several areas. In Canada, water surged up the Vancouver Inlet and flooded the downtown section of Port Alberni to a depth of 5 feet. A film report on destruction in the Northwest from Ted Bryant, station KING-TV, Seattle, Washington.
Washington's coastline was battered by the tidal wave. There was considerable damage here, but no one was seriously hurt. The story is the same 150 miles north of here in the middle of British Columbia's Vancouver Island, where the waves rolled up an inlet to inflict heavy damage. Here is more on that from George McLean of CBC News, Vancouver, Canada.
Tidal waves from the earthquake in Alaska hit 4 communities on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the twin cities of Alberni and Port Alberni, Port Alice, and Bamfield. Up to this time, it appears that the hardest hit area was the low-lying community of Alberni, where floodwaters of up to 5 feet covered the downtown district. At Port Alberni, logs from broken booms covered much of the harbor. The twin cities have a combined population of 25,000, and although the damage is extensive, no loss of life has been reported. The first tidal wave surged into the area shortly after midnight, but the third and most destructive crest did not come until 2:35 a.m. Fog moved in shortly after the third wave, hampering the efforts of police and rescue workers who had to grope their way through silt-laden streets in their work of evacuating the most seriously threatened residents. All taxis in the Alberni Valley and many private cars were pressed into service to move about 200 families from low-lying areas. Power failures also hampered the rescue operations, and at least 2 fires broke out, their cause attributed to escaping natural gas. The floodwaters knocked out 5 operations of the McMillan, Bloedel, and Powell River Company, a timber firm which is the major employer in the Alberni area. A company spokesman estimated damage at about $1 million and said it would take at least 2 days to resume limited operations. They include a giant pulp and paper mill. The Deputy Provincial Secretary, Laurie Wallace, has ordered civil defense units into action at all the damaged communities. The Federal Minister of Northern Affairs, Mr. Lang, assured the 2 stricken cities that government funds would be available for rehabilitation. The Red Cross in B.C. has also joined in the relief work. The homeless are being sheltered by residents on higher ground and in a number of civic buildings. At Port Alice, like Port Alberni, at the end of an inlet leading inland from the open Pacific, The tidal waves flooded several low-lying buildings and ripped boats and seaplanes away from their moorings. 5 airmen from the nearby RCAF station at Hallberg are reported to be missing on an overnight camping trip, and the ground party has been sent out to look for them. Damage at the central island community of Bamfield was comparatively light. A group of 50 teenagers had to be rescued from a beach on which they had become stranded. An 18-year-old resident of Port Alberni, Larry Reynolds, said that the second wave that struck the city sent people screaming about the streets. I was amazed, he said, to see 2 big houses floating out into the Somas River. They broke up and sank. Mr. Reynolds also saw people standing up to their necks in water, waiting to be rescued by boats or moving about in search of shallower water. The RCMP said it was a miracle that no one was seriously injured. Residents of Alberni and Port Alberni had 10-minute warnings before each of the 3 waves struck. The warnings came from the Bamfield lighthouse keeper at the mouth of the Alberni Inlet. This is George McLean, CBC, Vancouver.
The Washington coastline was hammered by 3 successive tidal waves last night, each diminishing in force. The middle coastline is a popular clam digging and camping area. In spite of the season, many persons were on and around the beaches when the first wave crashed ashore about 11:30. A number of house trailers parked in Ocean City State Park were smashed by the wave. Big logs swept along by the water were flung on top of the mobile homes. For many of the campers, that was their initial warning of the tidal wave. They'd gone to bed, were unaware of the earthquake hundreds of miles away and the churning wave that was rolling south. Some of the trailers were flung 400 to 500 feet from their original parking places. Somehow, the people inside survived their wild ride without being hurt seriously, though some had to swim when the second wave hit. A few miles north, the bridge over the Capellas River was ruptured by the cascading wave. A little later, a motorist, unaware the bridge had been swept away, tried to drive across it. The car plunged into the water. The driver got out with minor bruises. Another car, farther north, was swept from the road by one of the waves. It was a sheriff's vehicle looking for cars that might have been marooned. The officers got wet, but they weren't hurt. Some residents of the northern part of the coast, including an Indian tribe, were isolated when another bridge across a stream called Joe Creek was swept away. Near the mouth of this creek at Pacific Beach on the coast, a man named David Smith, who knew of the Alaskan quake and the resulting waves, heard the rumble of the approaching water. He and his wife pulled their 2 grandchildren from their beds, sprinted from the house as the wall of water shattered the building. For a time last night, all-out emergency measures were under consideration, and about 40 coastal residents were actually evacuated to the town of Aberdeen, some 30 miles inland. Most of them spent the night in a school building, the older ones drinking coffee, and this morning they went back to pick up the pieces. Though the damage appears extensive, no one along the Washington coast was seriously hurt. This is Ted Bryant, NBC News, Seattle.
Earthquakes are mentioned in recorded history almost from the beginning of man, and superstition has long been associated with the quaking of the earth. Early peoples believed that the earth was fixed in space, with the sun, the moon, and the stars rotating around it, and they naturally concluded that the earth itself must be fixed on some support. Earthquakes in ancient times were thus attributed to movements in that support. In Japan, at one time, the support was believed to be a huge spider, and later a giant catfish. In Mongolia and the Celebes, it was a hog. In India, a gigantic mole. In some parts of South America, a whale, and among some of the North American Indians, a giant tortoise. Many centuries passed before man discovered that earthquakes are the result of structural movements in the earth. NBC's meteorologist, Dr. Frank Field, and his guest expert explain.
The Earth's surface, the crust itself, is not a solid, non-yielding body. As schoolboys, we've learned that the Earth bulges at the equator, and that the tides in the Earth itself may expand it at the equator by as much as, 6 or 7 inches. Well, in order to understand what's been happening in that yielding crust, we have to get a cross-eye view of this. You see here is the crust of the Earth. This is where we're actually dealing with, right up there in the corner. Now, if we look closely at that section of the Earth, you will find that it is composed of layers of earth. These are layers which in some way will be affected by various forces. Now, since we've learned that the crust is yielding and that these forces will affect the crust itself, we examine these layers closely. The layers would indicate this. Normally, we have various types of earthenware across, running this way, the strata. Then we introduce a stress. Now, that stress may come from internal sources or external sources or a combination. The result is that
the weakest part of this birthday cake will begin to give. This is a fault area, and it will result in a fracture when the stress becomes great enough. This, in a large scale, will result in huge upheavals of Earth. Some of this Earth will move up, and some will move down. It's like taking a twig and bending it with a resulting crack. Well, the explosive force of this disturbance, the pressures that result here, will be sent all around the world. Now, if we have a station in a city far distant from the source itself, the impulse will send out to this station through the Earth and along the surface of the Earth various tremors. Moving out in this direction, since this explosive force moves in all directions, it will also affect the ocean surface, sending out great tidal waves. Well, now, if we follow this swing of energy down through the Earth itself, we can actually measure at any point around the Earth the tremor itself. Now, we have with us Father Joseph Lynch, who is director of the Fordham University Observatory and one of the world's most noted seismologists. Now, Father Lynch, can you tell us what was the magnitude of this tremor as recorded right here in New York City at your observatory?
Well, before answering that, I'd like the people to see just what a record of the quake actually looked like. I would only go so far as to say that this quake was comparable in intensity to that of the San Francisco quake. There is an arbitrary scale, the Richter scale, and on that scale, the San Francisco quake was 8 1/4. How much greater than that this will be will require at least a week's measurement, as you can see from this record. Those lines are so complicated that until we are able to measure the exact amplitude of the important lines there, I could not answer your question in greater detail.
In other words, after the initial disturbance that we have here shown on the graphs, you expect further.
Normally, you do get a considerable number of aftershocks, but I would like at this point to clarify some apparent upset that has crept into the afternoon papers. As I left the observatory, we had picked up 12 aftershocks, the only important one of which was at 7:30 this morning. Now, in the afternoon press, I understand a report has gone out that a very serious aftershock occurred, something like 3:40, roughly. Looking over the stations that are reporting, I think it's fairly safe to say that there has not been any aftershock comparable at all with the original major shock.
This takes care of the uniformity in reporting. But now, just some points of interest. Is it possible, were there any signs or any significant features in your work or in any other work that might possibly relate to these earthquakes? Is there any way of predicting?
I wish there were. And if you can come up with any possible way of predicting earthquakes, your fortune is more than made. The only thing that we can possibly hope for is that in regions like Japan and California, where the strain is constantly building up, they hope to be able to measure the rate at which this strain is building up and also the breaking point, that is to say, the limit to which the strain can go before the quake occurs. In that event, then they will be able to predict for that particular area approximately when the next outburst will come.
At this point, all we can hope to do is measure the intensity of these earthquakes as they occur, and they do occur every day in very minor ways, but do not affect us unless such a catastrophic event occurs.
That is true.
Thank you, Father Lynch. Frank McGee.
When the quake hit, President Johnson was starting his Easter weekend at his LBJ ranch. Almost immediately, he received a telegram from Alaska's Governor William A. Egan urgently requesting disaster aid. Egan told the president damage could easily reach a minimum of $250 million through a widespread area. President Johnson answered that all Americans will pull together to meet and overcome this blow, and all Americans join me in extending the warmest sympathy to our countrymen in Alaska, backed by action. That action the president spoke of consisted of ordering into effect the disaster facilities of the government to provide emergency housing, feeding, and medical care for people in the affected area. In Washington, NBC correspondent Peter Hackus has a full report on the disaster relief work.
The Pentagon received the first report of the Alaskan disaster a half hour before midnight last night, Washington time. By daybreak, General Maxwell Taylor, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had called together top military and civilian officials of the Pentagon, plus Edward McDermott, the government's disaster coordination chief. Moving quickly, it wasn't long before McDermott, who is shown here on the right, flew to Alaska, along with that state's two Democratic senators, Bartlett on the left and Greening in the middle. That was the beginning. A dozen planes by now have flown to that state. More are on the way. They're carrying blood, medical supplies, emergency food rations, Red Cross disaster workers, thousands of so-called comfort kits, a packet with razors, toothbrush, combs, soap, towels, and other necessities. They have also carried medical technicians, doctors and nurses, Marine guards to prevent looting. They have transported such large installations as a mobile control tower for the devastated Anchorage airport, several mobile electric generators to restore power, and considerable electronic gear to patch up and reestablish broken communications. Agriculture Secretary Freeman here in Washington has ordered tons of federal food stocks in Alaska, mostly stored there for use in the school lunch program, to be made available for relief purposes. Officials of the Commerce Department have begun work on emergency highway and rail transportation. 4 hours from now, the first Air Force ambulance planes are due to arrive in California and the state of Washington, bringing back the first evacuation of the injured. Both Red Cross and the Pentagon have been flooded with thousands of phone calls, naturally, from anxious relatives. As of this hour, only one military man is reported to have died. Officials at both places have urged the public not to call. All next of kin, they say, of dead and injured will be notified just as quickly as possible. They add that communications with those on the scene is difficult now, if not impossible. The Red Cross is advising those who have called in to contribute money or clothing that they may do so through their local Red Cross chapters. Here in Washington, disaster coordination is continuing. It will continue. As one Pentagon man who's been on duty for more than 12 hours told me a moment ago, we'll do everything we can and then some. This is Peter Hackus, NBC News, Washington.
During the course of this broadcast, we've been able to establish contact with Mr. Hugh J. Wade, who is the Alaskan Secretary of State. He's in Juneau, Alaska. We have him on the line now. Mr. Wade?
Yes.
Can you give us the latest information on the situation in Alaska?
Well, Mr. McGee, the situation is beginning to clear a little bit up here. You see, Juneau is the capital of Alaska, and it's about 800 miles away from the center of this quake. We've got a big state up here. But the governor has left here about 3 hours ago, together with several other state officials and members of the state legislature, to go to Anchorage and view the situation personally. I talked with him a few minutes ago. He reports that, fortunately, the casualty list up there is not as great as first thought it would be.
Do you have any estimates, sir, on how many dead?
The closest I can give you, I think, will be less than 50 people.
That's great good news.
Yes, it is, because the original estimates were much larger than that. And,
Time for one final question, sir. These later tremors, have they caused any additional damage?
No, they haven't. It's generally assumed that they were the effects, after effects of the original, and no additional damage was created by them.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
NBC News, good evening.